Hello, welcome to another episode of the One Health podcast. It's me, Sapon Kumankuma. In this episode, we will talk about vaccines. This particular word has been making waves all through this pandemic. It has been at the center of a lot of controversies and has championed many conspiracy theories. In this episode, I seek to clear some misconceptions and paint a true picture of what vaccines are. And I also take you along the historical pathway and establish the safety and the risk involved with the use of vaccines. A vaccine is any substance that, when administered to a human being or an animal, enables that individual to develop immunity against specific diseases. Let's take it this way. You are going to write an exam and you are given the exam questions before the exam date. And you solve these questions over and over again. You realize that all things being equal, on the day of examination, you are going to blow the paper. So vaccine acts in a similar manner in the body. They teach our white blood cells about the disease and teach them how to fight the disease when they meet them. So they sort of give the exam questions for the disease to our white blood cells, so that when they encounter the questions in the future, they're able to clear it and pass very well. Vaccines are very specific. They work for specific diseases and specific pathogens. So in cases where a vaccine is said to protect against several diseases, it means that vaccine has a lot of components that are specific to the various diseases that are assigned to it. Like in the case of DHLPP, it protects dogs against distemper, hepatitis, leptospirosis, parainfluenza, and parvovirus. A similar one in human beings is the MMR vaccine, which protects against measles, mumps, and rubella. So historically, the closest act to vaccination can be traced as far back as to the Middle Ages. This particular act was very widespread in Africa, China, some parts of Europe, and the Middle East. This was called variolation. Variolation stems from the Latin word for smallpox, variola. So it happened that people who were healthy tried to infect themselves with smallpox from sick people. And by doing so, they ended up inducing immunity in themselves against the smallpox. But along the line, smallpox ended up devastating humanity. In fact, it got to a point that every year, more than 400,000 people were dying. So one British doctor called Edward Jenner one day sat down and analyzed the whole scenario. So thinking about it, he realized that milkmaids, those who were milking cows in those days, were not getting smallpox. In fact, they were said to be the most beautiful of the lot in those days. They had very, very nice skins. So this man, thinking about it, tried to find a link between their work and they not coming down with the disease. So he reasoned that cows also get a disease called cowpox. So it may be that these girls are not getting smallpox because they are already exposed to cowpox. So to substantiate this claim, he had to inoculate a 13-year-old boy with cowpox and later on inoculate again with smallpox. And it's happened that the boy did not get the disease. So his claim was established. And afterwards, a lot of people were inoculated with cowpox and they ended up being immunized. With the advancement of science, the vaccine was developed and improved such that by the year 1980, smallpox had been eradicated. And this is a very important landmark as far as human health is concerned. A similar feat was achieved in animal health in the year 2011 when rinderpest was eradicated all through the efforts of vaccination. So after Edward Jenner came another man who is not unknown to science, Louis Pasteur. He was the first person to develop a vaccine in the lab. So he developed a vaccine for fowl cholera. Afterwards, he would go ahead to develop vaccines for anthrax, for ruminants, and rabies for humans. So the same Louis Pasteur was the one who introduced the word vaccine. He did this in honor of Edward Jenner. So vaccine comes from the Latin vacca, cow. Vacca, cow. Since Edward Jenner used cowpox in his endeavors. So as we have seen, and as we will see in the next story, cows have not always been known for beef and milk. They've also helped human beings advance medicine. In fact, Louis Pasteur, I hail him for his achievements and his works. His impact has been felt in both human medicine and animal medicine. A true One Health hero. And people he nurtured would go on to develop a vaccine known as the BCG vaccine. Yes, this is the vaccine that the French doctors were suggesting that they are tested in Africa. So before we come to the coronavirus and the link with the BCG vaccine, let's talk about those who developed it. BCG stands for Bacillus calmette-guerin. So it was developed by two doctors. One was a vet, one was a medic. So another One Health collaboration. So Camille Guerin was the vet and Albert Calmette was the medic. And they did this from the Mycobacterium bovis. This is the bacteria that causes tuberculosis in cows. Yes, cows get tuberculosis and they can pass it on to human beings. In a period of 13 years, they were able to do this in a period of 13 years, from 1908 to 1921. So this particular vaccine, BCG vaccine, is almost 100 years. Yes, so it's not a new thing. Why then were the French doctors and people in general associating it with COVID-19? So scientists have found out that aside it's being able to induce immunity specifically for tuberculosis, it also elicits non-specific immune responses. So that means, and that is not specific to any disease. So these people are speculating that the non-specific immune response induced by the BCG vaccine may be able to help fight the COVID-19. Trials are still ongoing in Australia, Spain, the Netherlands, and other countries are joining in. India is set to begin trials in the next few weeks in Maharashtra state. We hope something good comes out of it. Yes, so after all these people, a lot of vaccines have been developed, both in the field of animal health and human health. Now let's look at some of the types of vaccines we have. So largely before a few days ago, the vaccines that were in existence were either live attenuated or inactivated. Live attenuated means the microbe used for the vaccine is alive and therefore is able to replicate when it is introduced into the recipient and end up inducing the immunity. But in this case, the organisms are weakened or altered such that they will not be able to cause disease. But in cases where the recipient is immunocompromised, a disease may be established. Example of such vaccines is the chickenpox vaccine, the oral polio vaccine, yellow fever vaccine, and the age-old BCG vaccine. And with inactivated vaccines, the microbes used are dead, so there's no need to worry about them being resurrected. And the other types, like the recombinant protein vaccine, which include vaccines like the human papilloma virus vaccine, which protects women against cervical cancer, the hepatitis B vaccine. And these ones come about when the genetic material of the pathogen is infused into another organism for the organism to produce proteins similar to the ones found on the pathogen, so that when it is introduced into a recipient, the person is able to develop immunity against that particular pathogen. And the other types like polysaccharides, which are mainly sugars found on the cell wall of some bacteria, and the toxoid. With toxoids are inactivated toxins. So some bacteria cause disease by their toxins, like a disease like tetanus. Yes. So the toxoid is an inactivated toxin that helps the individual to be able to fight the toxin in case it's introduced into the body. And there are very recent ones like the DNA RNA viral vector. This was how the Ebola virus vaccine was developed. So a vaccine does not come alone. A vaccine comes with three components: an antigen, an adjuvant, and an excipient. Antigen is the main part of the vaccine that will induce immune response in the human being or the animal receiving the vaccine. And the adjuvant is just something that helps the vaccine to be established in the recipient. And the excipients are the parts of the vaccine that help to stabilize the whole preparation. So they include buffers. Buffers are able to maintain a constant acidity in the vaccine. You have the preservatives, which are self-explanatory. So now let's come to one thing that is troubling a lot of people: the safety of vaccines. The safety of vaccines. To understand the safety of vaccines, let's look at how vaccines end up being approved. So first, it goes through a preclinical phase where all the experiments are made, all the speculations, everything is put together. That's when all the underground works are made. In the preclinical stage, mostly animal subjects are used, and they may use tissue culture, they may use cell culture in that phase 2. Then phase 1. Phase 1 is when they begin experiments in human beings, in volunteers who would like to be used for these experiments. And mostly 10 to 100 people are used in this phase. And when the vaccine passes that phase, mostly 70% would pass this stage. It proceeds to phase 2, where a larger population is used, from 100 to 300 people, where the therapeutic dose for that vaccine is established. And it is known that about 33% of all drugs that make it to this phase are able to proceed to the next phase. That is the phase 3. And with phase 3, a larger population, like 300 to 3,000, are used. This is where the stage before the approval. So this is where all the corrections, all the observations are made, and the risks and the safety is assessed. And it is known that 25% of all drugs that make it to this point are able to proceed through approval. But after this, all is not done, because after approval, the phase 4 study also begins, where they continue to monitor the long-term effect of that particular vaccine and see if there was any adverse effects in the wider population that was not noticed in the previous phases. You realize that in all these phases, the safety of the vaccine is really assessed. There is no way a vaccine will be approved if it does not meet the safety standards. And in cases where they realize that it is rather detrimental, they are all recalled and they are no longer used. So with the use of vaccines, there are some problems that are sometimes encountered with some adverse effects with the use of vaccines. And commonly, people who receive vaccination end up feeling some slight headaches, some fever, some tiredness, some general malaise. All these things are normal after receiving vaccines. But in severe cases, which are rare, people develop allergic responses, allergic reactions to the vaccine or some of the components of the vaccine. And these are rare cases. But generally, vaccines are safe regardless. Talking about the safety of vaccines, people who feel vaccines are unsafe usually target one disease, that is polio. And personally, it breaks my heart that a vaccine like the polio vaccine would receive such a bad publicity. You see, what the headlines are not telling us is that polio is about 99% eradicated. That is some good news, and that is worth celebrating. What the headlines will not tell us is that in the past 10 years, about 3 billion people have been successfully vaccinated and have been immunized against polio. That is something worth celebrating. But they dwell in the few unfortunate situations and generalize the whole thing. And they are targeting people with controversies, and they are slapping them with conspiracy theories, which is very sad. And they are very ludicrous to me. Very ludicrous to me. Now, let's analyze the situation. With polio, since it's a live attenuated vaccine, the virus is able to replicate in the person who receives it. That means the virus will be able to multiply, and that same virus will be able to be shed into the environment through the person's feces. So there are two things involved. It's either the person who received the vaccine becomes sick of polio, what we call the vaccine-derived paralytic polio. Vaccine-associated paralytic polio, VAPP. And it's rather unfortunate that someone, would go seeking to be protected against something, and the person comes down with that same thing. It's very sad. It's very disappointing. It's very heartbreaking. But let's look at the numbers. It is estimated that in about 2.7 million people who are vaccinated, one of them may come down with that vaccine-associated paralytic polio. So why then don't we look at the 2,699,999 who ended up being immunized against polio? But we dwell on that one person who got paralyzed. That is sad. Yes, that is sad and unfortunate. I agree. I feel for that. It is very sad. But let's also look at the bigger picture and appreciate the impact and see it as not bad after all. You understand? It has done more good, much more good than harm. Now let's look at the second situation too. That is the disease caused by the circulating vaccine-derived polio virus. So when a person is vaccinated, yes, the person will shed the virus in his or her feces. So in a situation where someone who is not vaccinated ends up ingesting this virus, then the person is likely to get immunized against polio. Yes, even that person can get immunized against polio. But while the virus keeps circulating in the environment, it keeps on mutating. So it gets to a point when the virus will be able to cause disease in someone who is not vaccinated against polio. That is very important. Someone who is not covered by the vaccine, not someone who is already vaccinated. And again, the numbers speak for themselves. In the past 10 years, about 3 billion people have taken the oral polio vaccine. And only 750 of the disease caused by the circulating vaccine-derived polio virus has been recorded. Yes, the numbers are large, but as compared to the 3 billion people who have received immunity, then I think it's quite negligible, even though it's rather unfortunate. So what I want to drive across is these things happen. Yes, there have been situations where people go to the hospital and they come back worse than they went. That is an unfortunate situation, but that doesn't mean the hospital was established to to worsen the situation of people. No, people sleep and they never wake up. Does that mean you shouldn't sleep because when you sleep you also die? No, that's not the essence of sleep. So when we paint a picture that makes it seem that someone somewhere had an ulterior motive, someone somewhere was so wicked that he wanted to annihilate people, he wanted to... No, that is not the situation with vaccines. That is not the situation with vaccines. I think I'm getting too emotional, but I just have to do this. And it's not like I'm trying to defend anybody. The Bill Gates people are targeting with all these controversies. In fact, we are billions of dollars apart. But surely I'll also get there one day. I just want us to understand that vaccines are very safe. Vaccines are safe. Let's trust our health authorities. Let's trust the World Health Organization. They are all working in our interest. The moment we lose trust and we begin to do things on our own, we find ourselves in a worse situation than we'd ever be in. So let's just trust them. And amidst this pandemic, let's stay safe. Let's listen to our health authorities. Let's follow guidelines. And let's keep praying because God is in control. Yes. Thank you very much for making time with me once again. It has been the One Health Podcast with me, Sapon Kumankuma. See you in our next episode. Bye-bye.